Welcome to this OT1 lecture on the book of Genesis. And actually, in this course, we have two more lectures on Genesis, the last two main narrative sections. So this one basically on the Jacob narratives, and then the last lecture overview before the midterm period of this course will be on the Joseph narratives. So here we are essentially focused on really the big issues of these 10 chapters, 26 through 36 of the book of Genesis. And here we meet the next main character, Jacob, remember, in the line of Abraham. So in fact, if we go all the way back to the early chapters of Genesis, we remember that a main sort of genealogical issue in the book is the way God has sovereignly and graciously chosen to work through a particular family line. From Adam to Seth, remember, down through Noah, through Shem, through Terah, who's the father of Abram, who becomes Abraham, then through Isaac, and now, of course, through Jacob, who in this narrative as well has a name change. Remember, Abram's name shifts to Abraham, which technically means in the Hebrew father of nations, and Yaakov's name, Jacob, shifts to Israel. Jacob's name means the heel, he who grasps by the heel. There's something of the trickery and the treachery there on the human side. And Yisrael is essentially, the etymology of that name is he who wrestles with El, with God. So you have that movement even in the name of one of the main characters, at least in this section of Genesis. And then, of course, we meet the wives of Jacob, who's known as Israel as well, and his name mainly in this narrative is Jacob, Leah, Rachel, and each of their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. So right here, even in the title, we're immediately faced with one of the key ongoing issues in these Genesis narratives, especially from chapters 12, basically with the call of Abraham, to the end of Genesis in chapter 50. And that is this clear contrast between the human sphere or plane of activity and the divine sphere and the divine plane of activity. God is involved clearly in the lives of these patriarchs, of these matriarchs, and we clearly see sin on the human side and trickery and all kinds of sinful actions where we as readers, in a sense, as we encounter this narrative, are being asked through the Word of God and are being challenged in a sense of, with that ongoing question I'm trying to get at. Will the line of promise endure? Will the line of promise endure? For example, Jacob has multiple wives, and that's, as Abraham did, for example. That's not God's ideal, polygamy. What God works through human failure and human frailty to carefully and faithfully advance his plan of redemption for all the families of the earth. Remember, in the language of Genesis 12. So that's a bit of the flow here, a bit of the flavor in a sense, as we come to chapters 26 through 36. So first, point 1 here in the lecture, just a brief reminder and then a couple of notes on the transitional chapters. So if you go back to our earlier discussions, you'll remember that we talked quite a bit, right, about this Hebrew term, Toledot, the generations of, the genealogy of. So, as I was just mentioning, Terah is the father of Abram, who becomes Abraham, and that well-known verse, 27 of chapter 11, is the official beginning of the Toledot of Terah, who's Abram's father, and then, of course, Abram to become Abraham is the main character of that particular section, all the way through chapter 25, verse 18. So the first part of chapter 25 is the notice of Abraham's death and his descendants. That's the close of his Toledot section. You can see there in verse 7 of chapter 25, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age. That's a recurring motif in Genesis, that language. An old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Okay? And then my point is, if you go to chapter 19 of verse 19 of chapter 25, we move then to the next Toledot section. These are the generations, the Toledot, of Isaac, Abraham's son. So notice how Isaac has been one of the main characters, right, already in a sense, because we've been expecting Isaac to come, and he finally does miraculously, and he marries his wife Rebecca and so forth. So you have this genealogical transition, because what is titled again as the Toledot of Isaac is actually, the focus is on Jacob the son, so that which comes from Isaac. That's the idea, right? So back to verse 19 of chapter 25 here. These are the generations of Isaac, Abram's son. Abram fathered Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rivkah, that's the Hebrew for Rebecca, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram. And all these names and geographical locations are important for what's coming in the narrative of Jacob. So, Rebecca is the sister of Laban the Aramean to be his wife. Verse 20. And Isaac prayed to the Lord his wife because she was barren. Another motif, right? As Sarah was initially barren. So verse 21, chapter 25. And Yahweh granted his prayer, and Rebecca his wife conceived. And then we're introduced, right, to the first two sons here of Rebecca and Isaac. Who are Jacob and Esau, right? The two brothers, the two sons. Two nations are in your womb, is the language of the Lord to her in verse 23. And two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. So that's another theological and literary motif, a recurring theme in a sense, in the book of Genesis, right? If remember, of course, back to the first two sons of Cain and Abel, we have a similar pattern here with Jacob and Esau. Look at verse 27 of chapter 25. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, right? As Cain and Esau, the same, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, same kind of parallel. Well, Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game. He liked the food. But Rebekah loved Jacob, probably because Jacob was around a lot more. So, again, we're introduced to these key characters for the development then of these next 10 chapters. And it's done again, for me, it's a reminder of that interplay of the human and of the divine. We meet real human characters. Remember, even right here in chapter 25 is the well-known short narrative on Esau selling his birthright, right? Esau is the firstborn and has the birthright, but out of hunger, right, sells his birthright to Jacob. So he swore to him in verse 38, so Esau swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau, who had been hunting, right, bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. He needed his needs filled immediately. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So that's a very clear pattern there that is set up. So my point here was to show the transition that occurs in chapter 25 between what we could generally call the narrative of Abraham and Isaac, and now we're very much focusing to the narrative beginning especially in chapter 26 to the focus towards eventually Jacob. So in chapter 26 we have another parallel and literary motif that's recurred several times in our text here. So there's a famine in the land, and Isaac, right, the father of Jacob and Esau, is going to Gerar. Gerar is south and west, and it's a Philistine city, and he ends up interacting with Avimelech, the king of the Philistines at that time. Okay, so this is another parallel unit. Remember, there are a couple of times, like in Genesis 12, where his parents, Abraham and Sarah, had encounters with the Pharaoh, and Abraham claimed that Sarah was his sister to want to try and protect her. Same kind of thing here. Isaac settles in the city of Gerar, the Philistine city, and again, he wants people to think that Rebekah is not his wife, but his sister. She was attractive, and he thought they would kill him because of that. But this, of course, doesn't work out. And it's, again, that recurring theme of human trickery and then divine providence, okay? So if you look at verse 9 in chapter 26, so Avimelech called Isaac and said, I'm saying Avimelech, it's the Hebrew pronunciation. Abimelech, the king, the Philistine king, said, "Behold, she's your wife." Verse 9, chapter 26. "How then could you say she is my sister? Because I thought, lest I die because of her. And what is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." And then Avimelech addresses the situation from his point of view. So, again, what the man Isaac tries to do is trickery. What God works is God's divine sovereign plan, even through human trickery, human failure in a sense. Because we read then in verse 12, still in chapter 26, the Lord blessed him, Isaac, and Isaac became rich, gained more and more, until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. So he's wealthy in that cultural context. And by the way, flocks and the possession of flocks becomes a key motif then in the description and in the development of the Jacob narrative. So, we're still moving towards the focus on Jacob. And in 26, we see, interestingly, through the eyes of a non-Israelite, through the king of Avimelech, by the end of this chapter, in verse 28, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, these are the Philistines speaking, "Let there be a sworn pact between you and us, and let us make a berit, a covenant with you." So this is an example in Genesis in the Old Testament of a human-to-human covenant relationship. In a sense, as the Philistines are recognizing God's covenantal engagement with that people, they're recognizing that, and they want to engage with that from a human perspective for protection and so forth. Let's pause here, and we'll continue in the next video.